Lydia, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us. It's lovely to have you with us. For people who don't know who you are, can you perhaps give us a super quick introduction, just a bit of context in who you are and what you do in the food industry?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me, Laura and Julia. My name's Lydia Stratton. I am the Head of Commercial Development at RSPCA Assured, and my area covers the product side and supply chain. So I manage things like the supply chain traceability, the auditing, and also the commercial development side. So I engage with the retailers, food service, etc.
Brilliant. And you've brought two really interesting articles to us. So do you want to kick us off with your first article and just tell us what you've brought and why it caught your attention?
Yeah, certainly. Well, as we are within RSPCA Assured looking at food service, this article really did catch my eye. It's an article in the Footprint News from Food Service Footprint. It was written by David Burrows and published on the 12th of May. And essentially it highlights about the hospitality business and the concerns that social distancing is not really going to be commercially viable for quite a lot of these companies. It's a really sad situation, really, because there are so many wonderful small restaurants and cafes, especially in London and I'm sure throughout the country, that are really small, they have a very, very small footfall, I suppose you could say. And, compared to some of the big companies that we have, you really do wonder how they're going to manage. And so when the government, the chief medical officer, Chris Whitty, actually suggested that social distancing could be in play up until Christmas. I mean, that's a bit shocking because, everybody thought 3 weeks, 6 weeks, maybe till June, maybe till July, but Christmas. And I know that Kate Nichols, who's the UK Hospitality Chief Executive, she just hadn't considered that it would be so intrusive. And, she actually said in an interview that she thought it was an incredible shock. Well, I think it was a shock to everybody, not just her. However, the hospitality sector, is really going to struggle. And this is why it caught my eye, is that the government's 60-page recovery strategy says that some venues, which are by design crowded and where it may prove difficult to enact distancing, may still not be able to reopen safely at this point, or may not be able to open safely only in part. And the point of the pub, as CEO of Green King, Nick McKenzie, says, is the point of the pub is to socialise. So what on earth do they do next? It's shocking also from the point that whilst they're covered with the retention scheme up until October, the stats are really quite shocking. And, there's going to be a need for increased flexibility for hospitality because they're just not going to be able to go from standstill to full capacity, as Kate sort of highlights. And really the fact is that there is going to need to be a bit more clarity about what's going to happen. How are these pubs and clubs, and well, not so much clubs, but the small restaurants going to open if they've got to socially distance, especially when you've got small restaurants that have maybe, a capacity for about 20 people. And some of the statistics, which I just wanted to highlight, really is that apparently many businesses would open with just 30 to 40% of normal revenues if social distancing measures are in place. Many work on incredibly small margins and rely on high volumes of people. And they need, apparently, 60% of revenue coming through before they even make a profit. Really, the last couple of things were that with a survey that was done by the National Statistics Office, 1.2% had permanently ceased trading, 80.6% had paused, and 18.2% were continuing to trade. And according to UK Hospitality, 75% of its members were closed almost entirely, with 84% of the workforce successfully furloughed. So where do we go from here is the question.
And as you say, I think some of the figures around this, some of the stats around it are really quite sobering. And what struck me about David's article is the point you made, in that you can, on paper, you can have a situation where you say, hey, you can reopen again in some form.
Yeah.
And then in practice, you are still leaving these hospitality businesses with a completely impossible situation where they are having to adapt their business model so much that there isn't a business left. And it really reminded me, there was a interesting article in the Times the other day that sort of spoke to, I think, a similar issue. And they had an example of a small hotel that was trying to figure out how it was going to cope with social distancing. And they quoted the hotel owner who had to look at his conference room and basically say, well, how would I need to adjust that conference room if I had an event and people had to social distance? And he found he ended up being able to seat just 22 people, where previously he would have been able to seat 130. And at that stage, well, you don't have a viable business running conferences in your hotel anymore. So, yeah, as you say, it's just so difficult to see where these businesses are going to go next from there.
Yeah. Well, one of the things from that article, and you're right, some of those figures are sobering. I was quite surprised, actually, that the amount of businesses that have ceased trading was only 1.2%. I actually thought it would be higher than that, because there's a lot of discussion, isn't there, probably for the last 18 months, 2 years, about overcapacity in that food service market. And we've seen some big players exit the sector. And I didn't know if, as we've seen in high street retail, and we chatted about in week one, that some of them that were probably on the brink have decided to cease trading. So I was surprised that figure was less than 2%. And it'll be interesting to track that over the next couple of months to see if that does significantly increase. As you say, these businesses rely on heavy throughput, and without that, how are they going to be able to continue?
Well, I mean,
absolutely.
I suppose the positive side to it is that they have found other ways to trade. They are either going online where possible, or even just going on to takeaway. And certainly there are some in London that, they are well known. They might not be very big, but they have a following that wants to have the takeaway. They want to have sort of higher quality food or whatever it may be. And it's working for them. So maybe that's why they've actually adapted to the whole situation. So that's why it's less.
Sure. Thank you for your first story. I'm going to tell you about my first pick of the week, and I'm not going to make any apologies for it. I'm a big fan of John Lewis. I always like watching what they're up to. And they published a report over the weekend called Britain Through the Lockdown. And this is a survey that they've done of 2,000 representative adults in the UK across the last 6 or 7 weeks. And they've also cross-referenced that with their own data across not only John Lewis's estate, but obviously Waitrose too, and seeing what people are searching for online. And some of the figures in there are, again, really interesting. Out of food for a moment, the thing that leaped out was the growing number of people are making their own protective masks. And watching a lot of media this week, you can't call them masks, they're face coverings, but I won't pick them up on that. Driving sales of elastic up by 1,430%. Now, I know that's probably off quite a small base, but it's still pretty high. And I know I did sort of, when I read that, I thought, gosh, have we got any elastic in the house? And I was thinking about hair bubbles at that point for face masks. So face coverings. So the other really interesting, I guess, trends that we're doing as humans, popular buys, lockdown, massive trend. Landlines are up 80%, which is quite surprising. And then the second, which I'm not actually buying, but other spirits are available, tequila up 175%, and randomly decorative bedding up 130%. So what we're doing in terms of food was particularly of interest. 45% of the respondents to the survey say they're eating differently through lockdown. And I guess this is hugely interesting, as we've just spoken about. These changing times aren't just a few weeks, they're going to be months. So when does when does this change and eating differently become a permanent habit? And I guess for the food industry, this is something that we're very much watching. Half have worked harder to use store cupboard ingredients and not waste food. And I think that's a potential huge benefit of, what we've gone through, that people are a lot more minded about food waste. 38% have snacked more. I'm definitely in that category. And 19% are sitting at the table together for more meals, which is really nice, actually, isn't it, when we think about it? Because we're so used to that fast-paced life, and maybe particularly for a family unit, getting the whole family around the table at once has been pretty tough with different activities and that sort of thing. So that's really interesting. And then at the end of the report, there's some sound bites, as you would anticipate, some sort of corporate type sound bites, but from some experts within the John Lewis family. And there's a quote from Natalie Mitchell, who's the Waitrose Head of Innovation and Product Development Specialist. And she's talking about restaurant experience at home, which leads on nicely from your first article, Lydia, in terms of, looking ahead, many of us will be eating 3 meals at home, but people want variation of their cooking, particularly at the moment, and we need Saturday night type dinners. And it goes on to say that Waitrose are going to be looking for more and more products that they can, I guess, have at the premium end of their range to allow people to feel special in their own home and comfortable, but it's more than just your usual beans on toast or chili con carne or spag bol. That's all my cooking repertoire there, by the way. So what did you guys think of the report? Are you as geeky about John Lewis as I am? I'm really interested in everything they produce.
I thought it was really interesting, actually. I love John Lewis, actually. I thought the report was really good. It did highlight some changes, which hopefully will continue as we, when we come out of this, I suppose. And it's really nice to see people sitting down, to know that people are sitting down. I mean, certainly when you wander around, you see people with their kids, maybe slightly older kids than they would normally have had time to spend with. But from the report point of view, I found that what we've been doing at home was quite interesting, and the Joe Wicks effect, with 44% of us doing more exercise during lockdown. I think there was something like a 72% uplift in sales of sports shoes, which great. I've seen an awful lot of people trying to run. I say try. No.
I'm afraid I'd be in that category, unfortunately.
But also that, it said 51% spending more time with loved ones. So yeah, I thought it was an excellent report. Actually, it really highlighted the change in mindset, I suppose, because we've had to.
Well, what really struck me was precisely the point, Laura, that you raised about people trying to sort of recreate a restaurant experience in their own home. And it really made me think about my own shopping habits. So maybe I'm doing this wrong, but so I'm not online shopping. I'm shopping in store. I feel really self-conscious browsing at the moment. I would say I've become far less adventurous in my shopping habits than these people apparently have been, because I so worry that I'm going to hold people up. I'm going to dawdle. I'm going to look for ingredients. I'll maybe, shop for something slightly complicated. So yeah, it's had the opposite effect on me. I'm really interested that so many people seem to have used this as an opportunity to be more adventurous.
It's a great point you make there, actually, because I was speaking to a colleague in Canada yesterday, and she was talking about the garden centres have just opened in Canada this week, but they've got a lot of signage outside that if you haven't got a list, you're not coming in, and you're not coming in to browse. You need to be very clear on what you're getting. You've got 5 minutes in there, you're in and you're out, and you always think that, particularly a garden centre environment, that is where you're browsing and relaxing and spending a bit of time. So you're right, actually, for food retail, that's probably, it needs to be really in your face and easy to pick up and move on. You're right, otherwise you don't want to look at the back of packets and cooking instructions, because you're going to have a queue behind you, getting a bit angsty.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I can see that if you are one of the lucky people who have online delivery slots, then of course I think you can take your time a little bit more, and you can maybe opt for some interesting ingredients. I think kimchi was one of the other ones in there in the report, wasn't it? Massive uplift in sales of kimchi, or interesting kimchi. But yeah, I find I really feel under pressure to sort of go in and be out as quickly as possible. So I think there is clearly a challenge for food retailers to find a way for some of that product discovery and some of that browsing to happen, whilst at the same time sticking to, sensible social distancing measures as well.
Yeah. What was your first picker this week?
So my first pick this week is from The New Yorker, and it's an interview with Arif Hussain, who's the chief economist at the United Nations World Food Programme. I picked this interview because it focuses on an aspect of the coronavirus crisis that is becoming more urgent every day, and that is the impact on food poverty and hunger. We know, of course, coronavirus has been enormously disruptive to global supply chains, and the chaos that has brought is really having a devastating impact around the world. And again, the figures are quite staggering. So according to the UN, the number of people suffering from what they call acute food insecurity could double to close to 300 million as a result of this pandemic. And the interview in The New Yorker with Arif Hussain, I think, does a really good job of explaining some of the factors that are driving this. And I thought there were a couple of points that are worth highlighting in particular. I suppose the first point he makes is that the reason we are seeing the pandemic have such a devastating impact on food security is because our global food system was in many ways already precarious before the crisis. We already had a bad problem with hunger. We already had a bad problem with food insecurity. And so if you add a pandemic into that mix, you just, have a catastrophe on your hands. There's no resilience there. The second point that really grabbed my attention was that I thought Arif Hussain puts his finger on why this particular food crisis in the wake of coronavirus is so challenging, and probably more challenging than other food crises we've seen in the past. And the way he explains this is that he says, essentially, when we've had a food crisis before, you would typically either have a demand side crisis, so something like a recession, or you would have a supply side crisis, something like crop failures or droughts. And what makes this particular food crisis so difficult is that it's both at the same time. It's supply side crisis coupled with demand side crisis, all wrapped up in one. And to make it even worse, the supply side issues you have is they are extreme. I mean, you're looking at certain supply chains being completely shut down, commodities just not moving through the system, and people not being able to access food. And I suppose for me, the article, I think, highlights two particular questions, which is, on the one hand, given what we know about the impact on supply chains, how are we going to treat those supply chains in the future? I mean, he suggests that maybe we need to start thinking of food supply chains as essential infrastructure, and perhaps governments need to play a bigger role in ensuring those that infrastructure is maintained. But the main thing I think that really resonated with me here is his point about resilience, or lack of resilience, in the system, and how this crisis is exposing problems that were already there. And of course, that's true in the developing world, which he's largely talking about, as much as it is true here on our own doorstep, because of course we also have a big problem with food insecurity here in the UK. We also have big problems with vulnerable people suddenly being exposed to food insecurity, which this crisis is highlighting.
I found it quite, it was a brilliant article, actually. I was actually shocked by the detail in it, and the fact that, it's unprecedented. And I think the key thing that struck me was that it's uncharted, and the supply chain movement, you've never had this where it's stopped. The whole thing has stopped. Not even in the Second World War did everything stop. So, it was really quite shocking. And really, I suppose one of the key points that was made in the article was that if the commercial supply chains don't work, the humanitarian supply chains won't work either. And we don't always necessarily think about that.
Absolutely. It really reminded me actually of an article that you discussed, Laura, last week, which was where commercial passenger flights stopping had an impact on, fresh produce supply chains, for instance. And I think, Lydia, it's, as you say, it's that sort of unintended consequence. One part of the system fails, and then another part that wasn't even on the radar necessarily for us, the humanitarian supply chains, also fails because it relies on that infrastructure.
There was one line in there that really hammered home to me, and it said, it's never a good idea to starve your neighbour. And making sure, and I thought, and that was mentioned a couple of times, and you think, for political and economic reasons, just do not do it, but countries are inadvertently or overtly doing it at the moment.
I do hope that what we're seeing at the moment, everyone's talking about how the pandemic is an opportunity to rethink the food system, and to what extent that's going to be possible, I suppose, remains to be seen. But I think when it comes to food insecurity, as I said, as much in this country as anywhere else, I do really hope that this can be a wake-up call for us to think about food security and food poverty on our own doorstep a little bit more. I think it's encouraging that the issue is starting to get a bit more coverage. But I think it'll be important that sort of attention is maintained afterwards, and that we're thinking really carefully about how we can rebuild a food system that doesn't leave vulnerable people this horribly exposed when things go wrong.
Yeah, definitely.
Lydia, what's the second article you've brought for us this week?
Follows on nicely from this, actually. It was an article. It's called 3 Ways Supermarkets Can Overhaul Supply Chains to Thrive in the New Normal. And it was an article from the 12th of May written by Lydia Stratton. Forgive me for I'm not French, I don't speak French, from Publicis Sapient, which I'm not quite sure whether I pronounced that correctly. However, they are a digital transformation partner, and they've just been highlighting that supermarkets really need to start looking at their supply chains and upgrade their digital technology to make it more robust and scalable. And highlighted also that it's those who don't do this that will not survive. This will, if they want to thrive in the new normal, they really need to look at this. And they were also just sort of highlighting how C-19 has exposed how fragile the supply chains and stock shortages are due to increased demand. I mean, that demand was so sudden, but unfortunately, apparently the algorithms they use are used to predict demand and plan the supply, but they're based on historical data. So they're looking at customer behaviour, weather prediction, upcoming major global events and the holiday calendar, but they don't consider the real-time information on what people are buying, what are they purchasing, and that's really what he's saying, is that the grocers must evolve their technology to have a real-time and end-to-end view on the whole supply chain, which absolutely, and detect the trends and demands, etc. And it's quite interesting what he's suggesting is that obviously this technology is all in place, but he's suggesting things like electronic shelf labels, which can react to limit the number of items that can be purchased. And so if people want to buy multiple packs of hand sanitizers, the price actually goes up as opposed to go down, which is a bit of a change from the bog off, where you're used to having, buy one, get one free, or 3 for 2, and it's cheaper. Now it's going the opposite way. Very interesting. And sort of finally, he's just saying that, obviously, for one supplier for certain categories, they have one supplier for certain categories. They're going to need to look at having multiple suppliers and, having their sort of stocks distributed across geographies, really, to avoid the shortages. So I just found that really, really fascinating. They're going to have to think about it. But it is a new normal, isn't it?
Yeah. And what hammered home to me on that was it's just that the rule book's gone out the window in terms of, retail always refers back to, well, how did we trade this week last year? And, what's the comparison? Whereas, as we're saying, that's gone, and it's not about, right, well, what day did a Good Friday fall on? That's irrelevant now. We're living in very different times, so it's making sure that they invest in, I guess, the right tech to lead them forward. What do you see coming out of that, Julia?
Again, I'm always fascinated when people talk about the need for big tech investments in the wake of these crises. I think there's some really interesting tech out there. I mean, I think it would be a brave retailer that is, adopting the system that you described. I think it's a really interesting kind of, example of what you could potentially do as if you can respond in real time to customer demand. Whether you would actually want to do that right now, and then the kind of customer reaction that you might get, I think is a different matter. But of course, we're talking about really huge organizations. So investing in tech, overhauling your infrastructure, bringing in new technology like electronic labels. Of course, that's not new. People had thought about this before the crisis as well. So I think the question for me is really around which of these bits of tech are we going to see the most compelling business case in the wake of the pandemic? Because if people perhaps couldn't quite make the numbers stack up pre-crisis, I'm not sure they will necessarily be able to do that post-crisis as well. So I think at the moment, you sort of end up with a laundry list of possible investments that everyone thinks they should be making and all the wonderful tech they should be buying in. But I suppose it's going to take quite some time for us to get a sense of, well, what sort of investment is actually going to deliver a good return on investment in this new normal? Because, while these are big companies, these investments are hugely expensive or can be very expensive. And changing technology in such huge organizations those are massive projects as well. I wonder how much appetite we're going to see for people to say, well, we've just come through a pandemic, let's now massively overhaul our IT infrastructure or completely implement new technology.
Or maybe what they need to do is actually look at what they've got and just enhance what they've got. Because finally on this article, there was the fact that the demand for online groceries has more than doubled, and yet the systems couldn't keep up. And so as a consequence, they actually missed a lot of sales online. I mean, you can't get on there now. You can't get an online delivery if you're not sort of vulnerable. It's an interesting one, that is. We'll see where we go.
And I suppose one of the difficulties you have at the moment is that we talk about the new normal, but we really don't quite know what the new normal is going to be or how long the new normal is going to last or anything like that. So, with something like online grocery capacity, I think a lot of the retailers actually have done a pretty impressive job of upping capacity in a really quick period of time. But of course, they will also be thinking, how much of this surge in demand around online is temporary and a direct result of the really extraordinary circumstances we're in at the moment, and how much of these new habits, these new patterns around shopping are going to still be there once we have looser lockdown rules and perhaps have moved a little bit more towards normal. So it's a difficult one to gauge at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm going to tell you for my second pick what our new normal could potentially be. It could potentially be speedy shopping. So this is an article from the Retail Gazette from the 13th of May, and this is Morrisons rolls out speedy shopping lanes for small basket shops, and this is a really interesting move by Morrisons. We're seeing huge amount of growth in the convenience channels and obviously online, as we've touched on, and also independents, be that butchers, greengrocers, your local high street have seen double-digit increase in terms of footfall. But for Morrisons, they're in an interesting position that they've got obviously a well-established estate, but a very little convenience store offering. So your likes of your Sainsbury's local and Tesco Express and their one-stop format too have done extremely well. So what Morrisons have done, they've taken a look at this and realised that they've got, as all the big supermarkets have, queues out the door with people with trolleys, but people don't want to be spending a huge amount of time necessarily in said queue, or they may be wanting just to do a smaller shop. So what Morrisons are offering is this speedy shop service. So for every one shopper that goes into a store with a trolley, they let 3 shoppers in with a handbasket. It does make me feel a little bit like supermarket sweep, because I do feel if I was one of those three with a basket getting in with the one with the trolley. I feel like you, Julia, as you said, feel a bit under pressure and I'm not allowed to browse. I think, it's almost a stopwatch on your wrist job. Anyway, speedy shopping, you'll be well marshalled around the store, and you also have separate checkouts. So really it's the handbasket checkout, and you can use the self-check as well, and it's card payments only. So it was really interesting to see, what different supermarkets are doing to deal with the new normal. And just off the back of that, I spotted the same day actually an article in Essential Retail about Lidl launching a chatbot to inform customers the best times to shop. Now this is on trial in Ireland, but you can go on WhatsApp and you can message the Lidl number to find out your local store, what the queue's likely to be, because I guess this is something that we're really unsure of until you actually drive to the supermarket. Not only, as we were saying, supermarkets don't know what stock levels are going to be, what demand. We don't know how busy they're going to be till you've driven there or walked there or got there. So to try and encourage people to come and I guess continue to shop in places like Lidl rather than going to your convenience store or your high street. They're trying new technology. So there's a lot of watching eyes on that to see if that rolls out into the UK as well after its trial in Ireland. Do you think some of these things are going to work? Do you find them exciting? I'm not excited to look at them in theory, but I'm not sure in practicalities if they will or not.
I think it's really interesting. I think that, there will be changes and people will stick with them. With this speedy shopping, it does beg the question about, queues in the shop, as you've just mentioned, Julia, the fact that, you feel that you've got to be a bit quicker. Not everybody feels that. Some people are standing there on their phones whilst you're supposed to be waiting to move out the way so you can get past. And then other times you're standing in the shop or you're standing queuing, you've got that distance, great, all the way to the door. And as soon as you get in the door, everybody's almost clambering over each other, maybe not quite the same as they used to. But it's an interesting concept. I certainly think it makes sense, but it does also beg the question, why didn't they do that before? Because there's always been people that want to rush through with a small basket, and the only option you've got is there's sort of 5 items at the till. And actually, I want 6 or 7, but that still is not a huge trolley load. So I think certainly it's making them think, and I'm sure quite a few of these things will go forward and change. Definitely, they'll change our habits.
I do wonder whether part of the motivation here, actually with both of these initiatives, is to almost find ways to reward shoppers for responsible behaviour in store. Because I think, I don't know whether you found that when you've gone to stores recently, or just anywhere actually, the lockdown, even before the changes that came in this week, I think people were starting to be a little bit more loosey-goosey and how they felt about social distancing. When I first went to my local Sainsbury's here and the local Morrisons as well, you sort of had people being very strict in sticking to, social distancing rules. And it's just become a little bit looser recently. And I could see how something like this, where you are giving the shopper agency, you are allowing them to pick a behaviour or to behave in a way that allows them to have sort of less contact, maybe spend a little bit less time dawdling in the aisles, or to pick a time when it's likely to be quieter, whether that's a way to sort of say, well, if people are going to be a bit more relaxed around these rules, we can incentivize them to behave in a more responsible way. So I think they're quite exciting. These initiatives sound quite small, but I think there's potentially quite interesting thinking that lies behind that. So I'm certainly interested to see whether they are going to be adopted more widely, and whether something like the sort of speedy boarding that Morrisons is proposing is going to be something that, they are going to make part of just the standard shopping experience. Because as you say, Lydia, I think there will definitely, I could see people getting used to that and saying, actually, it's quite nice to be rewarded for being a bit efficient. And maybe on the flip side, maybe you could have a sort of browsing slot as well. So for people like me who feel self-conscious about browsing and discovering new products at the moment are allowed to do that in their own time as well.
That's great. What was your final article, Julia?
So my final article for this week is from the New York Times, and it's a story about Melitta, the German manufacturer of coffee filters. I grew up with Melitta. We always had Melitta filters in the house. So this story immediately caught my eye. That's not the only reason, I promise you. But this is a story essentially of a company showing great agility and innovation in the face of a crisis. But it also brings us back once again to supply chains, you know, that sort of topic that's really been a red thread throughout our discussion today, and specifically the benefits of shorter supply chains in this example. So what Melitta has started doing is produce face masks or face coverings. They now make up to 1 million masks a day, providing much needed masks at a time when Germany is making the wearing of masks in public mandatory. And the reason Melitta was able to start producing so many masks pretty much overnight is because they had access to a crucial raw material within their own supply chain. And that material is melt-blown fibre, which I'd never heard of before I read this article. But it's a special fibre that's needed to produce medical-grade masks. And it's typically sourced from Asia. And of course, getting hold of it right now is really, really difficult because everyone is desperate to get hold of PPE. Everyone's trying to produce masks. But Melitta had plenty of that fibre, because it also happens to own a company that makes air filters and vacuum bags, and it makes that crucial raw material, the melt-blown fibre, in-house. So that's pretty handy. And then this coupled with the fact that what Melitta also found was that the shape of its coffee filters is not really 1 million miles away from the shape of a face mask. And that it could therefore use existing production equipment to make those masks. So those masks are made on the same machine as its coffee filters. In fact, when you look at the what they look like, there's some great photos in the New York Times article. I mean, they look like a coffee filter with some elastic, but because they're made from this special fibre, they're very clear in saying, please don't use them to brew coffee. That's apparently not going to be healthy. And so I think it's a really interesting story of having a company that, you know, on the one hand is sort of being really agile, but on the other hand has been rewarded because of these shorter supply chains, and because it decided to bring the production of a key raw material in-house. And yeah, they're up to producing up to 1 million masks a day. They've started donating those masks to employees and their families. The second batch they donated to charities, and they're now looking to get them approved by health authorities as well. And I think they'll be looking to commercialize them as well. So I thought a really interesting example of what we've been talking about as far as supply chains were concerned. Would you be tempted to wear a face mask that very much looks like you just took a coffee filter and added some elastic band to it?
Well, at least I can go and get the pack if I'm short.
Well, and I think before, just to make sure that people don't start actually wearing coffee filters, I should say it's only if you use the filters made from that super special fibre. Don't just use your coffee filters; it's not going to work. You need the special fibre, but you're basically going to look like you're just wearing a coffee filter.
Great story to finish on. Thank you.